Today's daf is daf Kuf Vav, and we have a little bit of a small agadic addendum to what we studied yesterday about the significance of Mayim Rishonim, Mayim Achronim, Ki Osir Avdimi, on the third line from the top. Avdimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel Omar, and he said, Mayim Rishonim, because he was negligent and he wasn't careful, whoever this anonymous person was, in Mayim Achronim, therefore Hachilu Basar Chazir, they fed him non-kosher pork. And the story is that there was a butcher who sold nevela and treifa to goyim when they came in to buy, and sold kosher meat to the Jews when they came to buy. And he would recognize and identify who was the Jew by the fact that he would wash his hands. And this particular individual was lax about washing his hands before eating, and therefore the butcher assumed that he was a guy, and he fed him pork. And Achronim, there was a story about Mayim Achronim, Otziu es ha'isha mibaila. As a result of Mayim Achronim, or shall we say, the negligence in fulfilling Mayim Achronim, a man came to divorce his wife. So what was the story, which is related actually in the Gemara in Yoma on Daf Pei Gimel? I'll just mention in passing, Rabbi Meir was of the opinion, the Tana Rabbi Meir, that a name of a person reflects his true essence. And he could determine whether a person was religious or Chas Shalom Russia by his name. He darshaned his name. The other Tanoim, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, they didn't buy into that. And at one time, the Gemara says that the three Tanoim, Rabbi Meir, and on the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, they were together in an inn over Shabbos, and and Rabbi Meir asked the balabas of the inn, what's your name? And he said his name is Kidar. And based on the way Rabbi Meir understood the word Kidar, he came to the conclusion that this fellow was not a religious person, but rather he was a Rasha. That's how he darshaned the name Kidar. Anyway, the story goes on, and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, who didn't bother darshaning the name, and therefore they had no reason to suspect that this innkeeper was a Rasha, they entrusted their money before Shabbos with the innkeeper. And after Shabbos, this Kidar denied that he ever got the money. And what happened was, because this Kidar, as a Rasha, was not careful of Mayim Achronim, they noticed that there were certain shirayim, like lentils, that were stuck to his mustache. Anyway, they came to his wife, unknown to Kidar, and they said to his wife that your husband had entrusted a certain amount of money, and he gave us a simon to tell us to identify us like a code that we should get the money back. And the code is that you and him had a meal together with lentils. And all this was because the Kidar was not careful about Mayim Achronim. She immediately brought out the money because they had the code, so to speak. And when the husband found out about it, he divorced her. He was so angry. Now the Gemara goes on and says there's more to that story than meets the eye, because Kiyasa Ravin came later from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, later than Rav Dimi. Omar, he declared that Rishonim hachilu b'sar nevela, achronim hargu es hanefesh. So the fact that that individual was lax in Maim Rishonim, therefore the butcher gave him the vela to eat, according to that girsa. And one could ask, what's the difference between, nevela and basar chazir? But that's really not an issue. But the Maim Achronim story is hargos hanefesh, meaning the husband was so angry at his wife for giving up the money and returning it to these great rabbis that he killed her. Well, okay then. Now, for some reason, the Gemara, this is something which I don't really understand. But the Gemara wants us to know which Amora, whether it was Ravin or Avdimi, related which story. Somehow we have to know that. It's got to be, we have to pass a test on that. So therefore, Rav Bar Yitzchak gives us a mnemonic device, Simonach. He says, Asa Rav Dimi Afka, Asa Ravin Katla. Now, Rav Dimi was the first of these two Amoraim who came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. And Afka means he removed her, which means he divorced her. And Ravin, who came later, because again, it can't be that he killed his wife and then divorced her. You can't murder your wife and then divorce her. She's already dead. So the first of the two must have been the divorce, and the murder took place later. So all you have to do to remember this is that Rav Dimi, who came first from Eretz Yisrael, told us about the first thing that Kedar did to his wife, namely he divorced her. And Ravin, who came subsequent from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel later, he adds the piece that after the divorce, he eventually murdered his wife. You know the famous line about they asked a certain rabbi, "Did you ever contemplate divorcing your wife?" So the rabbi responded, "Murder many times, divorce never." That's a mentality of a previous generation where you don't divorce your wife. Rabbi Abba Masni Chana Mehani v'Chana Mehani l'Chumra. So Rabbi Abba actually accepted both versions of the stories, and he accepted it l'Chumra. In other words, that the person who was lax about Mayim Rishonim, if you go with the first version of Rav Dimi, then Rav Dimi considered it more l'chumra in the fact that he was eating pork. Now, why is that so? So why pork is more l'chumra than nevela is a very fascinating lumdisha topic unto itself, because pork has two lavim, according to this approach. It's also nevela because there's no shechita for a pork, for a swine, and it's also a behemoth meah. So you get both. Whereas nevela means, that there was no proper shechita, but the animal per se is kosher, so you're not chayev for eating a behemoth meah. You're only chayev one set of malchus for eating nevela. Now, again, as I said, this goes into very fascinating issues about whether you get two sets of malchus for eating swine, for eating pork. Don't we apply the principle of ein iser chalal iser? Okay, anyway, let's now begin the major sugya for today's daf, and that is a distinction between what's called netilas yadayim and tvilas yadayim. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. I was not aware of it. But there are two ways and methods of washing your hands before a meal. One is in a kos, which you pour the cup of water onto your hands. That's what we're familiar with. And then there's something called tvilas yadayim. Like just like the body of a tome could go into the mikveh, and that's called tvila into the mikveh. So you have a mikveh that has arboim saw. So too, you have a parallel in washing your hands, that you don't have to necessarily washing your hands by pouring from a cup, but rather you could dip your hands into the water. And if that water is the water of a mikveh, and it would be kosher for tvila of his whole body, then how much more so? Again, I should mention, maybe I didn't emphasize this, that the whole purpose of Netilas Yadayim is not just cleanliness, but also it's tahara. Because we're always afraid that if he's careless about washing his hands before he eats Chullin, then if he's a Kohen, he might be careless about washing his hands before he touches Truma. And if his hands are Tmeim, then they will be Matami the Truma, which we're not allowed to do. And not only that, you can't eat Truma Tmeya. So that if there's tefillah on the entire body to remove tumah, and if we assume the purpose of washing your hands before eating, even in the case of chulin, is tahara, to remove any tumah, because maybe you touch something tameh, then how much more so would tfilas yadayim, by dipping your hands into the water, be effective if that same mikvah could be mitayr his entire body and remove tumah? Now, you may recall that we discussed yesterday that hot water is not a good idea for Netilas Yadayim, and we spoke about something called Yad Soledesbo. Now, in the natural universe, there's something called Chame Tveria, and the water is heated up apparently from the what's it called, the center of the universe, the core of the universe, whatever it's called, and the water is hot. And the question is, can you use that for Netilas Yadayim, which would mean you dip a cup into Chame Tveria and then you pour the water on your hand. Then there's another shaila whether Chame Tveria are okay for Tvilas Yadayim if you jump into the water or dip your hands into the water. And that's a machlokas between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. Itmar, Chame Ha'or, if you heated it by fire, then Chizkiah Omar Ein Not Lemen Yadayim, right? You use an artificial method of heating the water, then it's completely possible for Netilas Yadayim. For Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Not Lemen Yadayim. Why? Because Rabbi Yochanan says that if you used heat to heat up the water, then before you heated up the water was cold, and it was kosher l'tfilas yadayim, l'netilas yadayim, and once it has the status of kosher for netilas yadayim, it retains that status even after you heat it by fire, as opposed to the case of Chame Tveria that we discussed before, and it's coming up now around the bend, where the water was hot from the beginning. It wasn't that you heated it up with a fire artificially. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shalti is Rabbi Gamliel beno shel Rebbe, v'ochel taharos. Rabbi Gamliel was very makpid. He only he was makpid on eating taharos, which we call prisha, and we also call it ochle chulin bitara. And Rabbi Gamliel was very scrupulous and meticulous about tahara, and he was the son of Kiddush of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So any testimony about him is very reliable. The Amarli, and yet he told me, Kol Gedoli Kol also came. That all the greats up in the north in the Galil would wash their hands but with water that was heated up by the fire and then poured into a cup. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, I have ample testimony and I have great shoulders to stand, to stand on that this is okay against Chizkiah. And the reason why Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Chizkiah is because before the water was heated up, it was cold. But Chamei Tveria, here, we're going to soon see that there is no machlokus between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. And even Rabbi Yochanan is going to say that Chamei Tveria, which are hot meikaro from the beginning, from the get-go, are excluded from the Netilas Yadayim. And then we'll discuss Tevilas Yadayim in Chamei Tveria. Chizkiah Omar ein notlim mehem liyadayim. Chizkiah says that logically you can't argue that these waters at one point in time initially had the status of being valid for the Netilas Yadayim because it wasn't a matter of heating them up with fire. They were naturally found hot in the springs of Tveria. Aval, but nevertheless, matbilim behem hayadayim. Why? Because let's say you would siphon off some of the water from Chamei Tveria into a little ditch or a canal, and then if you were Tumas Haguf, you jumped into and would Tovil into Chamei Tveria, you would be Mitar yourself from Tumas Haguf. How much more so can you be Mitar your Yadayim through Tfilas Yadayim? Again, keep in mind, we're not talking about Netilas Yadayim because Chizkiah invalidates Chamei Tveria for Netilas Yadayim when you take Chamei Tveria and put the water into a cup, but he validates Chamei Tveria for Tvilas Yadayim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kol Gufo Tovel Behen. I'm not going to deny that if you siphon off some of the water of Chamei Tveria, you can, if you're Tommy Tumas Aguf, you could jump in and be Mitar yourself. I don't deny that. Avalo Panav Yod V'Raglav, which is another way of saying Yodayim. He used the term because usually when they wash their hands, they wash their feet as well and their face as well. But he's talking about Tvilas Yadayim. The Gemara can't accept Rabbi Yochanan's statement at face value. Impossible. Hashta kol gufo tovel behem panav yod v'raglo kolshke. If he's entirely tamei from head to toe and he goes into the Chamei Tveria, he's metayirim, and that Rabbi Yochanan concedes, then how much more so if he's only tamei in his yadayim? Certainly Chamei Tveria could be metayir. So we're going to have to assume, and we'll see how Rav Papa fleshes this all out, that even Rabbi Yochanan would agree that Tvilas Yodayim in Chamei Tveria is valid. Okay, so where is the machlokus then between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan? Amar Rav Papa. So Rav Papa is going to divide it up into three cases, three scenarios, two of which there's no machlokus, and one in which there is machlokus. Two of which there are no machlokus in one direction, meaning Lakula, and two where there's no machlokas in the other direction, Lechumra, and then you have this middle case where there's a machlokas. If, let's say, as we said before, you draw off the water of Chamei Tveria into a ditch, and there's 40 saw, which is the share of a mikvah, in that ditch, then kuliyamalo pligi deshari. Everybody agrees that Tvilas Yadayim, as opposed to Netilas Yadayim, but Tvilas Yadayim is certainly valid. Now we have another extreme to the case to the other extreme where everybody agrees it's invalid. Mishkal minayu b'mana, if he digs his cup into the Chamei Tveria and then pours the cup over his hands, everybody agrees that it's asur, meaning that it's not valid. Why? Because again, it never went through that stage where Rabbi Yochanan was making because he turned on the fire, but before that the water was cold, not Chamei Tveria. Ki pligi, where is the machlok? So now we get into this middle case, which is a, in the worst case scenario, Gzera Derabanan. Ki pligi, the machlokas is the paskinu bibas birta. Okay, now here we have to know a little bit more about mikvos. And I have to admit, I never studied mikvos. The only part of mikvos I know about is when we get together for a yard site, or a shiva, or whatever it is. So we learn a little bit of mikvos. But I have a whole story about my father, how he got smicha with mikvos. Hold on. Anyway, apparently there's one halacha in mikvos, which is very, very relevant, practically speaking, that even if you don't have 40 saw concentrated in one place, but there's water elsewhere which has 40 saw, like a real kosher mikvah, and there's a channel that connects them. So even in less than 40 saw, you could actually be tovel in that particular case. And that's the case which is called bas birta. Bas literally means a daughter, but in this sense, proverbially, it means a smaller part. And birta means the channel. So he channels off less than 40 saw into a, what does he call it here? Into a channel. And that's where he's going to do his tfilas yadayim. Mar sova gazrina be bas birta atuv mana. In other words, it's such a small amount of water that even though technically he could be tovel and be mitaris entire guf, and therefore logically Chizkiah is right that he certainly could be tovel yadayim, if he could be tovel kol gufo, because of this connection to the main body of water, the Chamei Tveria. But Rabbi Yochanan made a gzera. Rabbi Yochanan was afraid that since it's a small channel of water, it might be confused with a cup of water, and you might be tempted to dig a cup into the channel of water and pour it on your hands, which, according to everyone, whether it be Chizkiah or Rabbi Yochanan, is not a valid netilas yadayim. So we're afraid that tvilas yadayim in this particular scenario would lead him to mistakenly do netilas yadayim. Now, I have a problem with this sugya, but this requires much more iyun, and that is, in the worst case scenario, the entire enterprise of netilas yadayim is only rabbinic. And we had a long discussion, if you remember, about halal gabi shulchan, put on the table with cheese and meat, and the whole issue is d'Rabbanan, and even in the worst case scenario, he eats the chicken with the meat, it's only d'Rabbanan, etc., etc. So we don't have gzera. So, but anyway, apparently the halacha of netilas yadayim is not to be defined as a classic d'Rabbanan, which it really is d'Rabbanan, but rather it takes on the status of an absolute chiyuv as if it were biblical. And now, if we're afraid that if you allow someone to do X, he'll come to do netilas yadayim, which is not acceptable, because both Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiah agree unanimously that netilas yadayim from a cup from water from Chamei Tveria is not valid. So therefore, Mar Sovar lo gazrina, but Mar Sovar gazrina, that Rabbi Yochanan instituted this gzera of Bei Birta Atu Mana. Mana means a Kli, and Chizkiah never accepted Kitanoi. And in fact, this issue is Bar Birta in Chamei Tveria is an issue about which there was a controversy between two Tanoim before Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. And it's recorded in a brisa that says, Mayim shenifsalu mishtias behema bekalim psula bekarka ksherim. Okay. So now the question is, if you have putrid water that's not drinkable at all, even for an animal, whether or not you can validate it for a mikvah. And here we have the shita of the Tanakama of this brisa, that differentiates between mikvah, which would mean karka, and that would include also tfilas yadayim, not just tfilas haguf, because as we said before, those are equated, as opposed to kalim. In other words, if you want to take this putrid water and put it into utensil and pour it on your hands, which are tmeim, that is not valid. But Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, af bekarka, even in the case where you did not dig your cup, your vessel, into this putrid water, but rather the water is collected on the karka, and it's putrid water, can't be drunk, it's not drinkable even for an animal, is tovel bihem kol gufa. I'm going to allow you to do a tefillah in the mikvah, because as we said before, mayim shenifsalu mishtias behemo is still kosher for a mikvah. I have a low pun of yodav, but not to wash his hand, but not to immerse his hands into this karka that has on it a collection of putrid water. And again, we're going to have to ask the question on Reb Shimon that we asked before on Reb Yochanan, hashta kol gufa tovel behem. Reb Shimon doesn't deny that you can be matar yourself in this putrid water on karka. Is Yodav Ragel of Kolshke? Why are you telling me that he can't be matar his yadayim if he can matar kol gufo? Elolav, we have to come back to that original pshat. De paskinu bebas birta. We're talking about a case where he channeled off a portion of that water, of the putrid water, into a small channel, and Pligi, and it's the same machlokus that we just interpreted Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiah, the Mar Savar, because Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion Gazrin and Bar Birta Atumana, since you're not allowed to take that putrid water into a cup and use it for Netilas Yadayim, therefore we're going to make a gzera that if we allow you to put your hands into this putrid water in the karka, you might come to remove the water, but with a kli, with a vessel, and mar sover lo gazrin. Okay, then. Now we begin to analyze or get an insight into this whole institution of Netilas Yadayim. What's it all about? If we allow a person to eat chullin, let's say a loaf of bread without washing his hands, then he might come to eat truma if he's a kohen without washing his hands. And if his hands are tmeos, he's going to be matami the truma. V'od, and furthermore, mishum mitzvah. So the Gemara immediately asks, my mitzvah. I mean, what did you add here by saying v'od mishum mitzvah? Now, I would like to offer two interpretations of Abaye. Either Abaye is saying that the institution of washing your hands before you eat chulin is not just what we call in fancy Hebrew, himanut mi isur. It's not just to remove you from being metame truma, but it's even a mitzvah. In other words, Chazal established it as a mitzvah. And my second interpretation of Abai is that Abai wants to justify why we make a bracha. And perhaps we're not going to make a bracha on Netilas Yadayim according to Abai, but in this interpretation, it could be that Abai means you're going to make a bracha asher kitshanu mitzvosav v'tzivanu l'shmoa l'divrei chacham. That would be the nusach of the bracha. Because the Torah says, "V'asisa kachal asher yerucha," the Rabbanan require that you wash your hands before you eat chulin, and therefore you make a bracha asher kitshanu, because God, you have commanded me l'shmoa l'divrei chacham. Rava Amar mitzvah l'shmoa divrei Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. An interesting kind of formulation or expression on Rava's part. Who is, in this context, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? And why is that important for Rava to say that that's what the Brisa means? I'm sorry, that's what Rav Idi meant when he said, V'od mishum bracha. Mishum mitzvah. And the answer is that Rabbi Lazar ben Arach actually holds, if you read this Gemara literally, Tosfos says you can't read it that way, but that Netilas Yadayim is doraisa. Why? Because he derived from a pasuk Chsiv v'chol sheyiga bo azov biyadav lo shatav b'mayim. And the question is whether or not we're talking about two different people here. Amar Rabbi Lazar ben Arach mikan samcha Netilas Yadayim min Torah. In other words, he's going to learn this pasuk, Rabbi Lazar ben Arach, as if it's referring to two different people. Number one is someone who actually had contact with the Zav, and he became Tomei. And number two, another individual who Yadav lo shatav b'mayim. He didn't wash his hands, which might be Tmeim, before he ate his Chullin. Mikan samchu chachamim l'netilas yadayim ben Torah. So that's what Rav Idi meant when he added v'od mishum mitzvah, and it's a mitzvah shel Torah. Tosfos says he can't say such a thing. There's no mitzvah in the Torah to wash your hands before you eat bread. It's all d'rabbanan. But samchu chacham means there's an asmachta in the Torah. And whenever you have a d'rabbanan with an asmachta, that upgrades it to a higher status. Amalei Rav Rav Nachman. My mashma, how did Rabbi Lazar ben Arach interpret the pasuk and come to this conclusion? T'chsiv v'yadav lo shatav b'mayim, hai shatav tahar. What are you telling me that in the pasuk that anyone who touches him is what? What are you telling me? Which if you read the pasuk kipshuto, then it sounds like the person who touches the Zav, he has to wash his hands, right? Yadav lo. What do you mean yadav lo? If kol yigabo, anyone who touches a Zav is a rishon l'tuma. He needs tefillah in a mikvah. Washing his hands is not going to help him. Tefillah boy. Elahachiko. Rather, we have to read the pasuk in two, referring to two different persona. The acher, another person, the first person touched the zav, he has to go into the mikveh. But someone else, shalota shatav, is tameh. That even though he did not necessarily come in contact with the zav, but he may have come in contact with the zav or another source of tumah, and therefore we consider him as a tummy if lo shutaf, he didn't wash his hands, because his hands are tummy. Anyone who washes his hands before a fruit, it's only a hygienic thing. It has no halachic significance, and certainly no bracha. And Savra Binei, when the Gemara heard Rav Oshia's statement, they thought he meant chovahu deleka high mitzvah ika. As we can go ahead and encourage him to wash his hands, but he doesn't fulfill any obligation. Amalei Rava says that's not so. With regard to peros, lo chova v'lo mitzvah l'rishus. It's a matter of cleanliness. You're in the mood to wash your hands, go wash your hands, but there's no mitzvah element at all. Upligid Rav Nachman. No, as Rav Yoshia says, it's a mitzvah, which means, you'll get some brownie points. It's not an absolute obligation, but it's a worthwhile investment of your time and your energy. But Rav Nachman says, no, this is what we call yuara. You want to show yourself to be super pious more than any other pels. That's called gasei ruach. Oh, I wash my hands before I eat fruits. Now, on the side, I just want to tell you, I have a friend. I know that Usher knows him, but anyway, he's a big Talmud Chacham, and he washes his hands before he eats fruits. And I didn't have the chutzpah of asking him why he does so. It sounds like he's migasei ruach, like it's gaiva. But the truth is, it's not gaiva at all, because there's a machlokes amongst the Gedolei Arishonim and the Beis Yosef and Shulchan Aruch bring down both days, in a case where you washed a fruit, and we've discussed on many occasions that there are machshirim liquids that came on top of foodstuff, and that makes the foodstuff susceptible to tumah. And therefore, my good buddy, when he washes his hands before fruit, that's only because he wets the fruit. Or like you and I and our wives are very mock, wash wash it, get rid of the pesticide. Once you wash it off, then according to the Shulchan Aruch, you should be machmir for that shita that requires netilas yadayim, because then it's muchshel kabel tumah. Omar Rabba Barachana Haviko Imna Kami de Rav Ami Rav Asi Aisu Lekami Kalkol the Peravi Ochluva Moshe Yadai. So I was there when these great Amoraim were brought a basket of fruit, and they didn't wash their hands. V'lo havi le midi, and yet they cut me out, meaning they ate what was in the basket, the fruits, but they didn't invite me to join them. Ubira chad v'chad l'chudi, and each one of these two, Rav Asi and Rav Ami, made a bracha achrona on their own. And from this story, we're going to derive three halachic conclusions. Shmai Yotas. Number one, Shmamina ein netilas yadayim leperos. The fact they didn't wash their hands means that netilas yadayim is only takana of lechem, of pas, but not peros. Shmamina, I'm going to assume, according to one shita, that these were dry fruits. Shmamina ein mezamnin ala peros, right? They would have invited me to join them for Birkas Hamazon, made a zimun. And in those days, I don't know if you know my friend Uri Pilchowski. Anyway, he's very makpid for this, that the one who's mezabein should recite all the brachos, and everyone just passively listens and says amen. That's the way it originally was. And if you have two people who are eating and a third person, you ask the third person to join you, and there'll be one Birkas Hamazon for all three of you. And here, in this case, Rav Ami and Rav Asi each made his own Birkas Hamazon. Why? Because they didn't invite the other one to join as part of the zimun. And mitzvah lichalek. And if there's no zimun, then each one should individually bench. And we should not apply the principle of barov hamhajismel for one person to be motzi someone else through shomei ka'on. Each person should make his own bracha. Only in zimun do we advocate that one person make the bracha for the other members of the zimun. Tanya nami hachi, we learned it in a brisa. Shnayim sha'achlu mitzvah lichalek. If there are only two people and there's no zimun, then each one makes his own Birkas Hamazon separately, individually. V'amid v'amurim shahayu shneim sofrin. Aval echad sofer echad bur sofer mevarach ubur yotze. I'm not sure exactly why the Gemara felt compelled, why the brisa felt compelled to teach me that, which is obvious. But in any event, a bur is someone who's an ignoramus. He has no education. He doesn't know how to bench. They didn't have printed bench rules in those days like we have today, a million different bench rules. Compile them up to the shamayim. And therefore, one person who's a scholar is called a sofer. Sofer means because he writes his chidushim and records them. So he'll be motzi the bur. Maybe there was a havamina that a bur, since he himself cannot bench, maybe he can't be yotzi with somebody else's benching. And he's completely potter. I don't know. Tana Rabbana, netil sidayim lechulin ad a perek and letruma ad a perek. So now we get into a discussion about what part of the hand must be washed. So, you have to ask a hand surgeon about this, but there's joint number one, right? That's this little joint over here. Then there's joint number two, and then there's the knuckle. That's the third joint if you're going from the bottom up. And then you have the wrist. Now we have netilas yadayim for chulin and netilas yadayim for truma. Obviously, the netilas yadayim for truma is more chomer, but the brisa records that all you need is ad a perek. Now, what is the perek? The perek is not the knuckle, but rather the second joint. Okay? Okay, the second joint, he calls it the joint that's common to four fingers, other than the thumb. And Rabbeinu Tana adds that the reason why all you need is up to the second joint, and you don't have to go all the way up to the to the knuckle, and certainly not to the wrist, but just to the second joint, which is what we do on Tisha B'av and Yom Kippur. Anyway, and the reason for that is because that's the part that comes in contact with the food, right? It's just your fingers. But the interesting thing is that the Tanakhama is saying that there's no difference here between Truma and Chulin. And we don't have to be more machmir in Truma than we are in Chulin. Or if you want to say it the other way around, Chulin was established as in the image of Truma. And just like in Truma, all you need is to the second joint. So too in Chulin.